afternoon.
All right, we're just settling in here. We're a small group in person and more people online. And apologize for the confusion on the dates. I think we still had a TPD setting on our website. But I'm glad we have our panel here today. My name is Carletta Chief, and I'm the director of the Indigenous Resilience Center. And I'm really excited to welcome our panelists here, Ronald Trosper, Franz Tax, and Paloma Bieber, who have different experiences in mentoring students. And we wanted to format our conversation today in a panel format. So our structure will be that first I wanted to share some reflections on the paper by Wind Chief, and then we'll have a set of questions for the panel, what the set of questions I sent to them before. And then since we have a really small group today, we're not going to do breakout groups, like maybe just one online and one here. But since we're small enough, we'll just do our breakout here together. So, but welcome to the last training of the Marco series. We've had a really successful run. I really enjoyed the tribal colleges training that we had last week by Ben Richmond and Anna Marie Stevens. It was really awesome, like just TOCC 101 with a lot of great tips and understanding how to work with tribal colleges. So one of our goals of these series is to implement it in some way across, within our institution, but also with our partners and within our center. So we're still brainstorming that and looking for partners. And so that's pretty much our goal for this entire effort, while training everybody in the process. So this training series is funded by the Provost Investment Funds. And so we're thankful to their financial support. So what we sent over the email were some resources that were developed by Sweetie Wind Chief. And Sweetie is a professor in education, and he has done a lot of research on working with Indigenous students and has developed an Indigenous mentoring research program and guidelines and protocols. So a little backstory about Sweeney. When I was a college student at Stanford, I used to call him to get my ACES scholarship because he worked in the ACES office. So from that time, I probably was a teenager, I remember his name because his name is like similar to my name. And then later on, I crossed paths again with him. So it's really neat to see that he went into this field as a professor. So Sweetie has written a lot of great papers, and he has a really nice IMP facilitators guidebook that Torrin sent. And the guidebook is really outlining what one can do to develop an Indigenous mentoring program at their institutions. And it's more like a check box type of approach. Like it tells you like what you should and should not do. But it doesn't have like content in there. It's really just to kind of give you like the outline and the skeleton of what an Indigenous. Yeah, I couldn't connect to the. Yeah, but showing Sweetie Wind Chief's Indigenous mentoring guidebook. And they were funded by the AGIP-T, which is the Alliance for Graduate Education, and with the Pacific Northwest. and it was an alliance of universities working together to learn how to mentor Native American students and faculty. So this guidebook is really helpful. It basically just provides a skeleton, a template, some resources, a few videos, but really that you have to develop yourself based on your institutional resources. So the second one is the paper that he wrote that is based on the Indigenous mentoring model. And it's a paper called Conceptualizing Mentoring Program for American Indian and Alaska Native Students in STEM Fields, a review of the literature. And in this paper, he talks about, the trends, the stats, and he proposes a mentoring model and explains why. So I really enjoyed reading this article, but I wanted to share some content from the paper. And what he says is that too often when faculty and staff work with Native American students, they do so with a deficit model. So thinking of like, oh, they're poor, they're first generation, or like highlighting their challenges rather than say like, oh, they have a strong family, or they have they know more than one language, they have different experiences. So what he argues in that paper is that we need to move beyond that type of perception especially when you're a mentor, and that also moving beyond the model that places a lot of the responsibility on the student and really who they are as an individual, like that they're Indigenous, that they come from a community. And I really appreciated that because I feel like I had a similar experience going through Stanford, where it was very, you basically have to swim or drown type of mentality. And that doesn't really work if you're like coming from the reservation, you don't know anybody that ever went to college, which was me. And so he lays out some statistics about how for Native American students, their the degree attainments are really, really low compared to underrepresented minorities. For example, these are pretty old, but for a population of 1.2% of Native people in the US, there is only 0.19% of Native American doctorate degrees earned in 2014. So that number is very low compared to, the number of Native Americans, the percentage of natives in the US. So he goes on and really explains that disparity, but how profound and impactful it could be if Native American students did earn these degrees, like how significantly influential they could be to be in a position to guide policies and programs and practices on tribal lands that will really support tribal sovereignty, tribal self-determination, and also because they know a lot about their communities. They know their community's priorities and their values and their interests align with their own communities. So he argues that we should include Indigenous paradigms in research to avoid exclusion of Indigenous researchers by placing them in prominent position to lead these discourse. So oftentimes the students' lived experience is not validated. So he talks about ensuring that there are ways to validate their experiences towards their academic success, and that mentoring programs could be tailored to the particular students of that are prominent in that institution. So this is his Indigenous mentorship model, and it looks like this. It's here's Indigenous mentoring model, and then it's factors to consider that would make it successful is that it's place-based, that the mentor is interested in mentoring and they want to learn and understand.
Dr. G, do you want to screen share?
I don't have a cord.
Oh, no, but even if you're signed into Zoom.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that feature.
Yeah.
Yeah, this will be better. Thanks, Torrin.
Sure.
I must still be asleep.
Oh, very good.
All right, so this is the Indigenous mentorship model, and the components that he outlines are listed here. Having a mentorship that's place-based, that the mentor is interested and has success mentoring students, that they understand the Indigenous identity continuum, which is that like Native students are all different. Like there's so many tribes, even like in Canada and around the world and Latin America, like there's so much diversity in it. And that students have different experiences as an Indigenous student within that continuum. They might have grown up in the city, or they might have grown up on the res, or they might have grown up in but well, just their lived experience are so different. So just understanding that diversity and valuing Indigenous worldviews, and then having an Indigenous family structure. And Indigenous family structure is really about clanship. Like in my family or in my community, we call it So there's always, well, maybe I shouldn't say always, there's some family structure that associated with Indigenous communities that is particular to the student. Like for me, I have 4 clans. I am Bitterwater, born for near the water. And then my maternal grandfather is Mini Goats, and my paternal is railroading to the water. So to me, like that is how I see my world as according to my identity. And so when students come into university, it's like they suddenly are forced to be assimilated. Their identity is not valued, or almost like they have to change who they are. So Sweetie argues that you shouldn't force your student to change their identity or force them to assimilate into STEM culture, but really elevating and encouraging their skill sets so that they can be successful in STEM. So I really enjoyed this article, and I just wanted to share that with you. And that will just be my, what do you call it, preface to our panel. All right, great. So today we have 3 panelists, and I'm gonna probably have to pass this mic around. So I'll start out with Ron. And so the first question is, please introduce yourself. What program do you represent, and tell us about your program?
So my name is Ron Trosper, and I teach American Indian Studies. My original training is in economics, but when I came back to the university, I started teaching in forestry faculties, mostly because I'm quite an interdisciplinary scholar and felt very comfortable in a forestry faculty where the range of fields is very great, and people learn how to cross fields and get along with each other. And that's where I learned much of my ecological knowledge, so I know more about forest ecology than other kinds of ecology. And I was hired to teach in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC to teach a course on Indigenous culture. And it was a required course that anyone who wanted to get a management degree in forestry in Canada from one of the top schools had to take a course on Indigenous viewpoints and worldviews. So I did study up on the local worldviews, which I'm from Western Montana, I'm from the Salish and Kootenai tribes in Western Montana, so I have a certain affinity to the culture on the coast Salish. I'm an inland Salish person. And it was enjoyable to be there and to work with the faculty. But at that particular school, the preparation for students to go into the sciences in Canada, and particularly in British Columbia, for Indigenous people is far below the standard of Arizona even. So when I was teaching at the university, at Northern Arizona University, and had a Native American forestry program, we were able to fill the Navajo department with Navajo foresters trained by the faculty, and lots of students could go to community colleges and then transfer in and do well in forestry. Whereas only the most entrepreneurial students who kind of made it through all the little barriers that stand in the way of getting to even undergraduate work, let alone graduate work. Whereas when we filled up the Navajo forestry department, then the people graduating from forestry started applying for master's degrees, and that was great. But then they would start their master's degree, and then they would be hired away by some other department in Navajo. And so that's an example of how the deficit model doesn't apply. And I'll tell another story about the deficit model. Between my working in economics departments and my working in forestry, I worked for my tribe for 6 years. I have a PhD in economics from Harvard. And so at one point, somebody from one of the big investment firms in New York was trying to trick us into investing in a hydroelectric dam. And they had made an offer that was absolutely incredible, assuming that no one could understand what they were about. So I got a lot of fun getting on the phone and doing my cross-examination of this person who absolutely did not know that someone with a PhD in economics would be working for a tribe and could start asking questions about to one of these major investment companies. And I don't want to say, I don't even remember which it was. They all sort of blend together in my mind. But and then when I was working at UBC, I went out to get programs, research programs with tribes in BC. And one time I was really cross-examined by a person who had her master's degree and said, well, this model that you're proposing is wrong for these reasons. And I thought, well, I've had my turn at this, but I had known that they were well prepared, so I wasn't totally surprised. But what happened was they assumed that I would have a deficit model in my head. So you have to watch out for that too. You get very angry people. So that was a little background on me. I do teach a course now in traditional ecological knowledge here at the university, in which I emphasize differences in worldviews. And I would have two critiques of what we just heard about Sweeney. Sweeney, I think, could have emphasized the relationality that people have, the fact that Indigenous folks really focus on building and maintaining relationships in families and in their political processes and in their economic processes. That's something that's important. And that among the spectrum of students, there are some students who do the code switching thing that we've heard about, where they're very comfortable in their traditional culture. When they come to university, they learn the university culture and they're very comfortable in the university culture, and they switch back and forth. So it's not a deficit for them. They can manage, and very often the students who make it into graduate programs are just that kind of student who can function in the standard academics, but has commitments at home and has demands at home that make life different. So I think an undergraduates would have the transition problem, but by the time people are masters and PhD students, they've probably conquered the transition problem, and they have other questions like how to work with their communities, how to deal with the culture that they run into in their graduate program. And since I've come from economics, that's a program that really is, you have a culture of economics when you go to graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, I saw that crystal clear. I can tell some stories about that too, but I'd like to pass the mic on to the next person. What was the other question I was supposed to answer?
I think you answered it.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm Franz Tax. I have this long title. So I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Diversity and Inclusion in the Graduate College. But what I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years is basically supporting diverse students in our graduate programs, mostly through 2 programs, well, 3 kinds of programs. So one is the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, and Ron and I are co-PIs on that. And in that program, we bring in 6 master's students and 3 PhD students every year, together with help from a lot of other programs. And then we support those students to graduation, and about 90% of our students complete. So I think that's a really good record, and that's largely because of our really excellent mentors and our really excellent departments. The second program that I support that has Indigenous students in it is called the Initiative to Maximize Student Development. It's an NIH training grant. We use that training grant for funding first-year students, and we do fund some Indigenous students through that program. And some of those students we also cover through Sloan after that. And so in Sloan, I kind of, so I'm, my family's from Europe. I was born in Europe. My parents immigrated when I was young. My father was a professor at the University of North Carolina. So I have kind of a deep knowledge of universities and departments and departmental politics and university politics and all that kind of stuff. And, so what I try to do is use that to teach students how to navigate those processes. And I would say maybe 2/3 of our students are in departments where they're pretty well supported, and there are a lot of other Indigenous or underrepresented students. But about 1/3 of our departments are about 1/3 of our students are kind of pioneers. And some of them are in STEM departments where they're the only student. And those students are where I think I spend most of my time, is helping them navigate some of these cultural things. And as Ron alluded to, and as I've learned, economics and physics and astronomy and some of the engineering departments have cultures that are kind of hard to manage sometimes for me. Like biology, I think, has got a lot of push from NIH to make the environment for students more welcoming, and other parts of science don't have that yet. And so we're trying to use some of those things that NIH is asking us to do around the university. So, one of the things that NIH has asked us to do is to develop a mentor training for all faculty. And so in thinking about doing that and having that being almost ready to go, it's there. It's going to be about a 2-hour online, program with about an hour in person. But there's still not really enough, I think, for mentors of Indigenous students. And Ron and I have both gone through Sweeney and Jeremy Garcia's Indigenous mentoring program. I think we made it through we went through to all the modules. But as Sweeney has said multiple times, that's a place-based training program. And so he and I have had discussions, and I'm trying to engage Jeremy, and hopefully this will happen soon. But we really should think about whether we, as an institution, should develop a place-based program for us, for the University of Arizona. And so that's something I'm just going to throw out there. That said, I've looked over our Sloan data, and I suspect it's not too different from the rest of our students around the university. But for our Sloan students, for the master's students, 2/3 or more are from Arizona. And the rest from around the country, but for the PhD students, it's about 50-50. So having it be place-based still has some constraints that I think, we still want to be a place that welcomes, all of our Indigenous students as well as all students. So those things are a bit complicated, but we do have ideas for how to develop and have available, more mentor training. There was one more thing I was going to say, but I can't remember what it is. So maybe I'll come back to it. Okay. Do you want to ask a question now, or should I let Paloma? Okay.
Dr. Sheep, sorry. By any chance, could you move the camera so that people can see who is talking? Thank you so much.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear me okay? I apologize. I had a cold last week from my toddler and now my asthma's all gross, so bear with me, and I'm a little foggy headed, but thank you, Carletta, for the invitation. And Chief, I always forget. But my name is Paloma Beamer, and I'm a faculty member in public health, where I've co-chaired our Committee of Inclusion and Equity for 8 years now, I think. But we were able to advocate, and now we actually have an associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion who has staff and a whole office. So my role there has mostly moved towards just mentoring our faculty of color in that role. But I worked with, I think I've mentored over 90 students since I've been at the U of A, and almost all of them have come either from underrepresented backgrounds in science or are first gen. And I think I come to this kind of between the two of you, in that I come from between two worlds. My father is from California, from an educated, privileged family that had been going to university for a couple generations. And my mother grew up in La Paz, Mexico, in Baja, in a cinder block house with a corrugated roof and biomass cook stoves. And I went between those two worlds all my life. And we actually lived in Mexico City till I was about 4, and then we moved here, and helping my mother navigate the American culture and, knowing what things were and language and other issues along the way, I think, just made me used to going between two worlds. And I had never heard that term code switching before, but I love it. That's why I was taking notes here. And I think that's kind of what has led me to where I am too. I'm a professor in public health, but I have a PhD in engineering from Stanford, and that's how I know Carletta. We did some of our graduate training together, and I often get underestimated in the quantitative sciences as well. And then, people think of public health as this fuzzy, thing, but understanding how to navigate those two worlds and the interdisciplinary areas that I work in, I think has brought me to where I am in my mentorship role with students. And it was interesting to hear you talk, Carletta, about this deficit model, and I definitely see that and feel that every time we have an admissions meeting, and it's one of the most difficult things I think about being a faculty member. But what I've learned is that I learn so much more from the students than I can ever possibly share with them. And if I can help, explain some of the culture of the university. I had a student fresh from Bangladesh in my office this week, and it was the first time, he's been here since August, that he went to office hours because he didn't know what they were. And realizing, like, we all take these things for granted, like, here's my office hours, I guess nobody wants to come, but not realizing that they don't even know what that is. And that meant a lot to me, because Yoshi, which was one of your students, she didn't know what that was when she was an undergraduate. And now she's a professor at Columbia. So recognizing how important just some of the things that we assume that everybody else knows in the academy, and recognizing those opportunities that we can share with our students. Like, I know that you are hoping to take more students to ACES, and I think I might have even written you into a grant that's due today, but we'll talk about that later. But it's one of Joe's grants, so I figured Carletta would be okay with it. But just those opportunities of, like, knowing the importance of going to conferences, of writing papers, of getting involved as early as you can. And I think in the work that I do, which is exposure science, which is the intersection of human behavior and the environment, and understanding how we're exposed to things and why face masks versus surfaces. One of the lessons that I've learned is that culture is so important, and understanding the different ways of life and how people are exposed to things, and the work that we have done. And we've been able to publish in that area, but it was such a, I think, we had just been shiprocked the day before, and I was in DC at a conference for EPA, and somebody said, culture doesn't matter in explosion. It was like, you know, it was like that experience of having just been there, and they were saying you analyze water the same way. I'm like, but you don't know which water to look at, unless you talk to people and find out what they drink. So I think that's one of the things that I've really learned in my mentorship with students is learning from them, and how can that make our science better, especially in a field like public health, where those are some of the communities that really need people from their own community to make the difference. I think it was Nura that taught me the importance of the students wanting to stay here locally. She gave me a pretty harsh lecture one day, but I love Nura for that, where I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like they got into all these better schools of public health. Why did we want to stay at ours, you know? And she was like, but they want to stay home. And so I like the idea of doing a place-based training, but I think for all faculty, not just the faculty that are mentoring Indigenous students, but that they should learn about what is so powerful about the land here and what the connection means. I mean, they all say their land acknowledgement, but making them learn more about what that actually means, I think would be important. And I think those are some of kind of my rambling thoughts, Carlotta. Sorry if it's not linear today. We both are deprived from sleep from our children.
Okay, the next question is, I think some of you have already shared this, but we'll just go back down this way.
Okay.
So the next question is, share your role in mentoring Indigenous students or students of color.
Yeah,
And
so
I'll add on to that, what challenges do your students face, and then what are some best practices?
well, I think I covered some of that,
Yeah.
but I'll
Yeah.
try to think. And I think one of the areas that I have spent more time might even be with faculty of color more recently. I've definitely worked a lot with students, but helping people navigate the faculty culture, which is a whole different set of ladders, has been, you know, again, going back to explaining what different things mean. What does a tenure line mean versus a career track? What's the difference between an assistant, an associate, and a full, and thinking through some of these areas and knowing what's important, so that we can, and being careful yourselves too, right? As junior faculty, you know, one of our faculty of color expressed yesterday, she's got 50 students who've come to her office this semester because she's a Black faculty member, and I get that, and knowing how to navigate that and recognizing that other people would write those names all down and put it on their CV at some point. So I think thinking back to it, you know, coming back, focusing in on learning from the students, what they want to do, what their hopes and dreams are, why they're here. I think one of your Sloan scholars has sat outside of my door for 6 years now, and started off with discussions on the way to Window Rock in the car, and now she's getting ready to finish. But thinking through how do we kind of push them to open the eyes to something they may not have thought of, like a PhD, and why that might be beneficial for their community and what they could do with it, and what the different ones are, and how can they bring their own perspective to it, which in public health, we're still kind of on the front ends. Economics is like, that was always the hardest, I think, of all departments I've ever worked with when I was at Stanford. But engineering had its own culture too, and in public health, it's easier to kind of push the envelope. And NIH is certainly giving us a lot of direction right now, where I can push some of my colleagues in pharmacy in ways that they're not comfortable with, but they have to listen to. But what can we do to support students, to bring more training opportunities? I've tried to involve them as much as I can in doing research that relates to communities that they care about, which is easier in public health because everybody has to do an internship. So we often have a group of 10 or so in my lab that all come, usually first generation, that all support each other from undergrads through my postdoc. And then trying to figure out how to create co-mentoring opportunities within the lab, and how to get them to help each other out, both because they have ways of explaining things that I might not think of, but also then it's something that they can learn that they can put on their CV too, for when they're applying down the road, that they have that experience. Which on search committees seems really important these days. I think I'm rambling, so I'm gonna pass it forward. Have way more experience.
Actually, Paloma said a lot of the things that I also would say. But one thing that I think is important, and so Paloma mentioned Nura. So Nura is a former person who worked in the offices of inclusion in the graduate college, Nura Dwale. And so, for those of you who don't know her, she's a real advocate for students, undergraduate students and graduate students across campus. And she and I are among the many founders of this ASEMS program. And so part of what I want to say is that, we want to really have as much contact with students as possible and try to impact them in as many different times and places as we can. So the ASEMS program recruits its students from basically, TRIO eligible students. It has a TRIO grant. And one of the things that I've thankfully noticed among the staff there is that there's a higher proportion of Indigenous students in that program than there might be in the undergraduate population. And it's a STEM grant. So that's very commendable. And so we really work individually with those students to make sure they find places to do research as undergraduates and really pay attention and encourage their participation in summer programs and REUs and things like that, just because they're excellent students. And we know that we have a community of faculty and scholars that can help them here. As part of my role in the graduate college, I also oversee the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Consortium, or UROC, as well as our American Air program. And we also try to engage our students in those programs if they haven't had research opportunities by the time they're juniors. And as part of that, we do graduate school preparation activities and panels, and Paloma has been great in being on some of those as well. And so, we really try to, to do our best to get our students to understand what graduate education is and what it can do. And then we have our graduate support programs, and probably half of our students Indigenous students continue from undergraduate to graduate programs. And I think that's in STEM, and that's pretty good. Some of them go home and work for a while and come back, and we're always looking to be able to keep in contact with them and re-engage them. One of the things that I recommend that I think is important is I do meet a lot of students when we're trying to figure out who's going to participate in these programs, and I've had the privilege to do a lot of traveling in Arizona, so I know where Tonalea is, and I know where I know a lot of the little nooks around the state. I've been in Shanto Canyon, and so I just try to talk to them a little bit, and sometimes they'll tell me a little bit about where they're from, but if they don't want to open up too much, that's fine. But over time, I just kind of try to get to know them and try to understand a little bit more about their background, what they're interested in, what motivates them, and usually they do some of the same things with me, and I'm usually pretty open about those things, and so that's fine. But I also just try to do that in a way to kind of make them comfortable and see that I also recognize them as individual, and that I care about what I care about their place and their identity with place. And so just little things like that I think help a lot, and this idea that's very complicated, which is that you have to treat each student that you have as an individual, but you also have to treat them all equitably, right? So there's some contradiction there, but you do the best you can in navigating those two things. I think that's my little ramble, so I'm gonna turn it over to Ron.
So as other folks have been speaking, I've been thinking about what I've been doing in this area, and the thing turns out, if I think back on it, lately I've been mostly helping PhD students write dissertation prospectuses. When I was at Northern Arizona University, we had an actual course where the students were required to write a master's prospectus. So I taught that there. I'm now in American Indian Studies, and we don't have such a course. But I ended up last semester making such a course as an independent study for 3 different students. And we set it up. I set it up like we'd done at NAU, which is the students reviewed each other's work. So as they developed their prospectus, they developed their title, they developed their research question, they developed their literature review, they reviewed the other students' actions. And that gave the students more views, gave them the experience of peer review, which itself is an important experience to get, especially if you're a PhD student. And so focusing on just helping the students get their own research project well-defined. And I had a great difficulty when I was a graduate student in economics, because I wanted to do a dissertation in the field of American Indian economic development and so on. And the cultural differences between the selfish-oriented economics department and the people that I wanted to work with was stark, and it still is. I've just finished a book on American Indian called Indigenous Economics, based on a course I teach here in Indigenous Economics. I did the same thing at University of British Columbia. And in both cases, the economics departments refused to cross-list or recognize the course because I would not require their introductory course as a prerequisite. Because one of the first things you do in economics is point out that the model of man as being a totally selfish person is wrong in general, and it's especially wrong in working with Indigenous people. You have to look at reciprocity and sharing and many other things. So I do think that as I would mentor graduate students, I tend to focusing on the learning, the culture of the field that they're getting into, and what some of the outlandish assumptions are that the professors accept, but that actually don't apply. And when I was at UBC, I ended up being one of the few professors being recruited to teach in their interdisciplinary PhD program. Because there's not a lot of folks, once they get assimilated into a discipline, there's not a lot of folks who are comfortable switching. And that's another kind of code switching between disciplines. Because the idea that we have subculture within the university is extremely important. And I got a bang out of Andrew Comrie, our provost. He said he regarded each of the departments here at the university as their own tribe. And he meant that in the sense that their culture is different. And I thought that was good. And no wonder he was such a good provost. He understood some of the cultural structures of the university. So I guess that's enough remarks from me. Let's get up to the next question.
Okay, so the fourth questions was what are your best practices in mentoring Indigenous students? And you might have already covered some of that already in your discussion, but if you haven't answered that question, my last question before we have a dialogue here is that in Sweeney's papers, he talks about place-based mentoring and different types of contact times, like what you're saying, or I think you were saying that, but just different ways of like connecting with students. And he actually had in his guide like about powwows, so I thought that was interesting. So there's this really like you're saying, you're learning about the community, you're going to the communities, understanding where they're coming from. And so my last question was, I think Franz already answered it. Have you visited a tribal land, and how has that helped you become a better mentor or be a colleague that can give advice to a fellow colleague about being a mentor to an Indigenous student?
So I'm a member of a tribe in Montana, the Salish Kootenai tribe. And so I'm familiar with my tribe, but, and then years ago, I married someone from Seneca, Tonawanda Band of Senecas, and I learned about them. And the really big difference about the Tonawanda Band of Senecas, people may not know this, but the women run things. And so that's something that is quite different. And in fact, the Senecas were the ones that got some of our suffragettes going back in the 19th century, because they would ask, why? We're the property owners, we appoint the chiefs. Why are you folks, you women, so downtrodden in the dominant society? Because the roles of different people are so different. I wanted to mention another story on this cultural point. Marshall Salins is quite a well-known anthropologist. I was on a committee with him. We were going to Alaska, to Inuit country. And he gave us a lecture. It was an interesting lecture. He said, this is one of the few non-American societies that have the same kinship system as you do. So that, pointing out that kinship systems vary. The Navajo one, we often are, people know where their clans are. But then our kinship system is when people marry, they go off and make their own family. And they don't keep connections to extended family. They don't have a lot of thorough connections to their extended family, which is unusual in Indigenous communities. So the whole role of family and how that differs, I think, is important for working with students. And another thing that I guess we're not going to get into that in this other sessions. I've worked with advising students when they work with a community and trying to help a community define a question that the student can work on. And this, just like many people, I myself, when I started out, when I got on my, finally decided to orient my PhD dissertation to my own tribe, I went back and talked to the tribal council. And that's when I got going on forestry. They said, we don't trust the foresters here, go study them. So, okay, so that's what I did. It didn't end up being the exact dissertation I wrote, but still listening to what the questions are and actually taking seriously what the people's questions are. The notion that a community, the world is learning this now, thanks to Love Canal and various other cases where community people have said this is a problem and we want it solved. Non-Indian community people have done that, and Indian communities too. So the idea that the questions that come from the community are legit and actually can contribute is something that people need to learn. And it's hard sometimes to convince disciplines of that, but still, that's another point to study on. Let's see if I had some other. I guess I'll pass it on and I'll have some other thoughts later.
So I do want to clarify. So I have worked in the Navajo Nation with a program that was working to have high school students do undergraduate research projects here on campus in the summers. And so I've been to several communities, but one of the things that Sweeney emphasizes is that this it's a complex negotiation of identities and roles, and it's an honor to be invited to somebody's house, right? And so I've been to these public spaces, but I have not worked with Indigenous graduate students in my own research or anything, and so I have not had an invitation to to actually visit somebody there. And I know that's something that he really emphasizes in his program, that's a great opportunity for faculty mentors and students sometimes. So one thing I want to say is that I totally get the whole deficit model. I do think that in some of so I work as a ad hoc committee member for admissions for one program, and over the last 10 years, the dialogue has really shifted, and some of that has come from these studies in biology where, to no one's surprise, the GRE turned out to not have any predictive value. And And so, what's in those studies, but what a lot of people don't pay attention to is that there's also not a lot of predictive value in grades in terms of graduate student success. And so I think in this particular committee, what we really look at in terms of admissions is letters of recommendation and students' personal statements. So students are really able to convey their passion for what they want to do and in the future and how they got there. And the letters are really strong. That's the major thing that is discussed. And so we kind of move when we start getting rid of the things that we look at numerically, we kind of get rid of a lot of the deficit model discussion. I mean, we joke about this, and some of you may be offended by this, but one of the things in sciences where there's a lot of failure is that people who are like 4.0 students, they really don't do well with that. And so sometimes we actually count that as a negative. That may be hard, that's going to be hard for engineers to take, but that's kind of how we discuss it sometimes in those meetings. And so we try to really evaluate students for who they are, for their passion, and I think that's really the way to go, and I think that's how we avoid a lot of the deficit model discussion, because the metrics they're there, but the reality is they don't really matter too much. So that's one thing we're really trying hard to do, and right now I'm working on a grant where we're going to try to look at kind of the whole graduate student lifespan from recruiting to admissions, and consider as an institution how each department or tribe does it differently, and so or similarly in how we can kind of learn from each other. So I'm hopeful that those things will start to dwindle, and hopefully with that study and grant and getting the information out, we'll be able to really make some major changes in how some of these things are done. I know that in some programs it's really much better. In other programs, there's still work that has to be done.
I want to make a comment that's relevant to what you just said. When I was in forestry, I discovered that students come, and most Indigenous students, they want to maximize their own personal learning. And many of the non-Indigenous students want to maximize their grade point average. And a student who maximizes their grade point average is actually quite differently from one who's just trying to learn for themselves. And it's also reflected in their grade point averages. A student who's there and wants to learn for themselves will regard the tests as just a barrier that's in their way. And if you raise the standard, we would admit students for master's programs and say, well, you're on probation until you get your grade points up. And the students would get their grade point up to the minimum that was required to stay in the program. That was it, because they're interested in the content and the topics, and they were learning, and they would just do enough. So all you had to do is raise the standard and they would meet it. And which explains why there's no correlation between success and grade point average, because understanding is not necessarily measured by grade point average. And so you can have a very, and some of our students were really good later on. So that's sort of a reason that grade point average might not count.
That echoes a lot with some of the things that I've experienced in the classroom too. I think I teach a 600 level class in public health. That's about a lot of skill building. Like some of it's more like writing and presenting, but also how do you work, to work with a client that you need to assess exposures. And I think I finally, one day I got so frustrated with all their questions about, well, will we get full credit if we did it? And I just said, you're here to learn. Don't worry about your grade. You're all going to pass. And they told me that was the first time anybody had ever told me that. This was a 600 level class, right, in public health. And it just kind of blew my mind. I'm trying to teach you skills that you need to go work a job in public health. One of the things that I've developed, I guess, as one of my best practices is these idea of group mentoring. So I talked a little bit about my lab, but anyone who's my advisee for their master's or PhD or my postdoc, they all have to come to a weekly meeting. And we don't talk about my grants or anything during that time, it's their time. and they can talk about their research, but they can also ask questions like, how do I review a paper or things like that? And we end up having a lot of the same discussions over and over. We did it all through the pandemic. Like some of them were still in Nigeria. I think when we started, we had a couple students join us from Nigeria, and that's become really important because a lot of times you don't know what questions to ask. So if your peer asks a question, you didn't even know that that was a question you had to ask in academia. And I think that's been one of the things that I've learned, and I see that too with the junior faculty of color group that I meet with them once a month, but a lot of times it's like, what is an annual performance review? How do you prepare for that meeting? And I was totally naive at my first one. I had no clue. So to have these discussions ahead of time, that this is not the time to come with your imposter syndrome and all these things is really, really important. And so I've learned the importance of that, but it's also the importance of building those networks. That's why Carletta and I know each other, is these networks they're very tight, but they're very small. I don't know if you knew that Kimberly and I did our undergrads together. So, we've worked, these networks where there are very few of us, and we were sometimes the only one that we know each other all across the country, and we can call each other. And I guess, helping students establish that and make those connections, I think is really, really key and can be really important. Because there's so few of us. I had a colleague from Michigan text me this week, and she was just like, oh my God, I just need to vent, and she was dealing with something in her department where she was feeling ostracized for being a Latina. So these are really important connections to make. And I guess this month is the 7th anniversary, right? Since we lost Maria Teresa, and that's who I always think of when I think of mentorship. She was my Tucson mom, but what I learned from her most was she never gave up on a student, right? She would bug them. And I think it's Nadia who brought to mind the image of the colibri or the hummingbird. So every time I see a hummingbird, I think of her, and she's there bugging me. Like, what did I do wrong today? She's here talking to me. And that's, I think, something that's really important is that, like you said, it's not the grades. It's not the GRE scores. I know that the term grit, not everybody likes, but grit is sometimes, like when I think of Curtin, that was how I knew he was going to make it and be successful. He had so much grit that he'd overcome. So I think, figuring out that skill set and how to identify that and cultivate and I think, when I was talking earlier about sometimes being underestimated, so many roadblocks get put in front of you in the academy. And a lot of times when people think you're naive about them, they put even more in front of you. And sometimes I just roll my eyes because it's like, oh my God, do you think I would be here if like this little roadblock was a hindrance? I'm going to go talk to that person upstairs. But I've had to learn that. And how do we build that skill set and that strength and the empowering in our students? Because they're going to have to fight a lot of things that mediocre people around them are not going to have to fight the same way. So Carla, you asked us about how working with Indigenous communities and visiting them. And I remember one of the first times we were up in Window Rock, I think for Navajo IRB, you said, what are your clans? And I was like, huh? You have to introduce yourself by your clans. And you said, I know you're white and Mexican, but like, what are you? And I was like, I don't know. Like my father's family has been in the US for so long. I know that they're of European heritage. And I think over time, we realized that when you and I talk about clans, I didn't even understand what Navajo clans meant. Because my dad's family, the one European heritage that we know of for sure is Scottish, which is a very different clan system. But because of that, the next time my dad was in town, he's the one that does all of our genealogy. I asked him, and you made me go back to my maternal line, which was interesting because I went back to my maternal line. It stops at my great grandmother in Mexico. That family has always been from Baja. If you look at her last name on the Mormon website, it only exists in Baja. So it's probably, an indigenous line if you think about the colonization of Mexico. And so that was an interesting, and I think I wrote about it. One of the things you made me reflect on, realizing that. And then my grandmother used to always say, agua es la vida, water is life. And so working with you on the river made me realize like, oh, this is a teaching from that part of my family. And my great grandmother, she was a curandera as well. So she had a lot of the herbal teachings and stuff, and recognizing that I just didn't know it or have that history or have that deep connection that you have that's been passed down through generations. Like it's there and it's somewhere in the back of the brain, but it's not the same. And it's almost like a missing limb that you didn't realize was there. And I think Patricia Gonzalez has written a lot on this. And talking to her about that was really helpful. But Yoshi and I reflected on that a lot when we were working up there, when it would just be the two of us. So your invitation to work on that opened my eyes in a whole different way, even about my own history and having to recognize the loss of culture that we lost. But I think now is an exciting time with a lot of the culture shift. I don't know what's going to happen next year in the elections, but NIH is certainly pushing hard on addressing structural racism to the point that the director of one of the centers that I'm on the leadership team had to sit through a 2-hour session on structural racism and called me in a panic and was like, do you know anything about this? And I was like, this is why I get up every day. This is why I'm here, is to work on addressing these issues in terms of environmental health. So that is interesting to me. And how do we use that shift to make a difference for the students here and now and moving forward in the future? I think is important to think about. Right now, EPA is opening up their arms in a different way as well. And so, you know, how do we do that to answer the questions of the community? How there's all these new opportunities. There's more than we can even apply for if we wanted to. So we need more students that come from those communities to take those on.
Well, thank you so much for sharing how you've been a mentor and your best practices and challenges that you've experienced in that. I really enjoyed hearing about all this, and even relative to my own experience as a STEM student and faculty. Recently, actually, I got invited to give a review on an issue, a paper on hydrology, women in hydrology. And they had documented all these white women, you know, since the 15th century of, you know, creating canals and, you know, doing different types of water research. And I was supposed to give like the Indigenous perspective. I was like, wait, we're just starting, you know, like we don't have that history of women, Indigenous hydrology in history, that 500, 600 years, and that we're just starting. A lot of it has to do with racism. And I think I was pretty tired, so I was just like, okay, just writing, like free writing, and you know, everything's coming out. And I was like, I don't think you want to add me as a co-author now after writing all of this. So I just said, well, you know, just see what you think. Because I was being truthful, and they turned around, they're like, oh, this is great. And so, but our histories within the sciences are very different in terms of Western science. But when you talk about traditional knowledges, that's when, you know, thinking about the positive aspects of an Indigenous student and their history, their culture, their language. That's what makes them a better student, a better scientist, a better engineer, is their own lived experiences. So that was my reflection on your dialogue. And at this time, I want to see if anybody wants to ask a question about what was shared today, both here and online.
I have a question, Jill. Oh, thank you so much for that. It was really thoughtful. And the part about grades really struck with me. So I'm Torrin Anderson. I worked with Carlotta before in her project Indigifuse, Indigenous Food, Energy, and Water Security and Sovereignty. And we work with a lot of tribal colleges. And I remember visiting a tribal college from Arizona, and they were so angry, like, you're coming from U of A, you don't recognize our students' grades, you don't recognize our classes, you're not recognizing how they do on tests. I mean, as soon as they found out I was from U of A, they were just pissed off, like, you are so, our students feel so unwelcome at your institute, just in the way we're treated. And we're working on a grant now, on a project now called Native Fuse Alliance, which is about creating pathways for Indigenous students in STEM. And I'm really wondering, like, where is the role of mentoring in these in-between spaces? So from high school to college, or from a tribal college, I mean, we're talking about mentoring, but they have to make it here in order to get that mentoring that we discussed. So do you know of any resources? I know there's like the Student Journeys program. I looked at Danny, but what other resources are there that could support Indigenous students kind of in this whole pathway? Are you aware of anything, or do you have any recommendations for like what could be done to make it more of an easy transition? We have to turn it back on.
So my suggestion would be to connect with. Brings me back to my teaching days. So my suggestion would be to connect with the ASEMS program, which has a transfer student program. And also some STEM grants that are between community college and the university. And so they would be able to help navigate some of those issues around course credit and things like that. But also just, they would have not just staff that could help, but maybe also students. And I totally want to echo Paloma's mention of both mentoring communities and kind of this idea of peer or near peer mentors, where matching students with a student who's just gone through what the student is going to take on is really ideal. And it's one of those best practices that I kind of made a list of, but I keep forgetting to mention. But I would definitely reach out to other programs on campus that have experience with that. And I think there's a couple. There's also one in the medical school that's working with, I think in particular with Dene College. So I think it's called, Bridge to Seam. So they, anybody who's navigated it before, it will be helpful to talk to them.
Great, thanks.
We have a question online, and it is about if a faculty wanted to mentor an Indigenous student, what actions should they take to start mentoring Indigenous students?
So you mean how to find the student? Yeah, I don't know. I think I would have to say, talk to Carletta. So I think maybe, that's a little bit complicated. So it depends on the level of the student. I think I would just, so I'm going to assume that the faculty is STEM, but if it's an undergraduate you're looking for, I might, contact the ASEMS program or even my own staff in UROC and just, talk to Donna, who's one of the coordinators there, and just let. I think it would be helpful. So if it were a community-based project or a project that was of specific interest to Indigenous students, that would also be a great thing to include as part of the description. That would be my suggestions.
I guess you could see that for us, it was kind of an odd question. And I think that's because at U of A, there's such a plethora of opportunity. It's hard to imagine that you've never encountered an Indigenous student to want to get started mentoring. And so I think it's about getting your name out there. I think Kimberly worked really hard to get it right on the APR, where it asks, are you willing to work with undergraduate students? And there's a little checkbox. And this year I made sure to check it because I had heard the whole story. But I think that's one of the things that we need to figure out how to do more of across campus, because those of us, we call it summer camp in my lab. We have probably 10 students every summer from different programs across campus, and none of the other labs in my shared lab space have more than one or two. And so how can we share, and I don't want to say the burden, the joy of mentoring these students, and how can we find more spaces like that across campus? So I think there are many programs, like you said, ACES. There's also Blazer and from Terra over in the health sciences. UROC has so many opportunities. And then at the graduate level, it's about, connecting with the students when they're applying, when they're considering going to ACES or SACNAS. I mean, these are conferences with thousands of Indigenous students, first generation students doing amazing work and research where you can connect with them, recruit them. And so I think it's about getting started, being humble, taking advantage of trainings like this one today, and going and doing these readings. I guess I have to do my homework for Carletta too. But this is one of the reasons why I'm here at U of A, is that I love the students we get to work with. I love that in some ways we operate more like an open access institution, and we can work with so many students who don't know what a PhD is or why they would want one, and help, form what that future looks like.
I also want to mention, so I was a graduate student at the University of Washington in Seattle, and in my lab over the, sadly, 7 years I was in my PhD, there were 4 undergraduates total. And so seriously, that was it. And so there were really very few opportunities as a graduate student to even mentor, because there were a lot of graduate students, and the likelihood that you would get one of those 4 was practically nil. But here we just have this, my lab is not so big now, but a lot of labs have 10 or more undergraduates doing research during the year, and so there's just a lot of opportunities. But my advice would also be to connect with one of these programs that's with a college, with a tribal college. I think that's where you could get the best opportunities for a student.
Okay, yes, Nancy. Thank you. Yeah, this has been fantastic. So thank you all so much. I've learned so much, and kind of along the lines with, how do people like the Howard program that we don't have direct interaction normally with Indigenous students? What can we do? Like, what would you recommend for us? We could either financial support or showing up, like what would be helpful for us? And then I was also really interested in Paloma's discussion about reflecting on her own tribes, and if we are invited, how do we share that? Is there a way to share that, or is it even necessary to share that, or appropriate to share that?
I could start out. I really learned a lot from Valerie Shirley. She's a professor in Indigenous education, and she's worked with the Indigenous Youth program, and now with the Native Youth Alliance. And in her research, she focuses on decolonizing education and also positionality. So even if you don't necessarily say your clans per se, but sharing your positionality as to who you are and why you are there and what brings you there when you introduce yourself to an Indigenous student or a community. So because you're asking so much from them that at the very minimum, out of respect, to share, your positionality in this work or what project you're doing. So that's in the sense of like relationality, which I think is for all humans. How are we connected to our communities and what brings us there? Our stories, like what Paloma was sharing. So that would be similar to what I would say, positionality. So I forgot your other questions. Oh, resources. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that's one of the reasons we did this training, is because I feel there's very little resources, and I have a similar experience with the colleague in public health that had 50 students at their office. I had that experience as an assistant professor, and a lot of things I wasn't prepared for, in terms of like trauma and, a lot of deep things that I didn't really know where to go for, how to direct students. especially because I was a new faculty and I wasn't prepared to do that. And then also, you know, how the students are from all different places and they have different aspirations, different departments. So it's like, how do we create a network of faculty and staff and programs that can help Indigenous students through their pathways in at these different in between stages. One of the things I understand with my Indigenous students is that they have responsibilities to their communities, and that what I expect of them as a professor will not fit their responsibility to their communities. So that means I have to be flexible in their schedules and timelines, you know. So they're not gonna necessarily finish in 4 years, and that's okay, because they go in and out of their communities. They're code switching, or they're in and out because of their responsibilities. So I think that's understanding the different journeys that Native students have. So anyways, we have a few minutes here, but I wanted to maybe have this last thought, if anybody wants to chime in, about where we can go from here. Is this a good training? Or you could put it in your survey too, you don't have to reply here, but is this a good training? Like, I've always thought like the U of A needs a training like this, but it's never happened. So finally I just like, do it myself. But still there was no like formal training besides what Sweetie offers on his publications. But as a university that has so many Native American students, it seems like we should have some sort of formal training or modules just for our students. So where should we go from here is the final thought. If anybody wants to chime in, or you will have a survey going out as well.
Dr. Sheaf, we have someone in the chat that commented something, and also Tashina would like to speak up.
Okay, thank you. If available to share, I think anyone who wants to learn to mentor should watch this panel discussion and read the supporting materials too. Would be a great first step and might inspire a faculty person to keep learning. One program is not enough, but a good beginning, by Tony Massaro.
And then Tachina, you can speak up if you like.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and use this because for some reason I cannot get linked to my chat. But going off of what you said, like how this should definitely be continued for conversation, because I feel as a graduate student in public health, I am getting a lot of information on, you know, how to be an efficient public health student and administrator once I get into a career aspect, but feel very, very ill prepared to work in tribal communities along those lines, because what I'm learning, I always like reference public health master's program as sort of like what we received in high school as Native Americans are hunter-gatherers, you know, the nomadic. Well, in public health, I feel it's just like glossed over. Tribal communities receive free health care, and they have their own Indian health services. Okay, let's move on to learning about Medicaid, Medicare, and you know what we're going to receive in like hospitals. But I also work in the community of healthcare professionals, helping healthcare professionals, and we have students who are non-Native getting most of their clinical work and public health internship work from these exact communities. And, you know, having to re-educate them on, you know, because you're working in that community, you're not an enrolled tribal member. And it's just like the basics of that I really feel are core curriculum and required classes that we're taking in many of these atmospheres are you have to take a certificate in order to gain that knowledge, or attend things like this to gain our knowledge. So we have to seek it out ourselves, which is great, but at the same time, it's still a disservice to non-natives who are getting their clinical work and, you know, their experience in tribal communities, even though it may be temporary, it's still being missed in our curriculum. I don't know if there were any thoughts on that or on how we can work together to mitigate that or find alternatives for finding where these exactly should be implemented. Is it at the core curriculum committee, or is it more like grassroots where we have to go to committees and try to re-implement that? So yeah, that was my thought.
Thank you to China for sharing that, because I agree with you. I hear that a lot from our students in public health. And I know Velia is working on kind of restructuring at least the core classes, I think with Dr. Ernst or Casey Ernst, to make sure that we're doing a much better, more uniform job, because it really depends on who's teaching those classes, what is even taught in them. And some people come at it from a lens that's very different from others, but I will take that feedback back. For me, I teach an environmental justice class in the fall, which almost no public health students take, which is interesting. We read some of your work in it. But one of the articles that we read is Critical Race Theory for Public Health from Chandra Ford. And I think it's probably similar to how Carletta felt about some of these readings. For me, it was very validating for the way that I approach my work, that she actually wrote it down in an outline in a praxis that I was like, oh, this is what I do. And this is why I do it. And I make the students in that class read it. But the year it really clicked for me, we haven't talked much about that here, but I was on, you know, what was it called? FACT, Public Health Advisory Team or whatever, to the president and the provost about COVID. And I remember a discussion there where I brought up that article that, you know, she says about focusing on the margins as a critical part of public health. And a lot of our university decisions were made by focusing, I would say, on the wrong margins at the time. And I did say that publicly, so I'll say it again. But I think what we've been through the last 2 years, Ticina, shows exactly why we need to restructure that public health curriculum, why we need to restructure those discussions, and even the decisions that we were involved in. And even the term of these vulnerable populations is something that if I had the time, I would write on it for a while. Because we're talking about people who are vulnerable because they're more exposed, not because they're more vulnerable, right? So I just want to thank you for your words, and I will take it back and keep trying to champion that. I don't have control a lot over the curriculum, and they don't even let me out to teach much anymore. But but I hope that you keep challenging your fellow classmates and your faculty to think more about these issues too and what they're doing. I wanted to go back to Nancy's question about resources. I think just what you're hearing us say, we need more resources for the mentorship that is done to, you know, underrepresented faculty across the campus. You know, I remember, I think I was an assistant professor and I was doing my APR, and my director at the time said, oh, anytime a student comes to my office twice, I write them down as a mentee. I was like, what? Well, then I would have a lot of mentees, you know. And so I think, like, not even knowing how to document that extra service that we do and how how to have protected time to do it, because it's so important, but we're still expected to do all the same teaching load and research and service load. And this on top, and we do it because we're passionate about it. But if there was a way to restructure or make some institutional change where that could count as much as any of the other service committees that we do, I think would be something that could be great from Howry, and also figure out how to send more of these students to those experiences like ACES and SACDAS. I think those are kind of some life-changing things. And I think back to the discussion about positionality, I think acknowledging your own privilege is also something that can be really powerful. And it was actually one of a program officer that Carletta and I work with, Liam O'Fallon. I saw him almost break down about, I don't think I told Carletta this, but a couple months ago, where he acknowledged that it was so unusual for him to be able to be a program officer without a PhD. But he was able to do that because he was a white man, and that he had come up through the ranks in different ways. And that was really powerful for him to acknowledge that publicly. And so I think, you know, taking advantage of those opportunities are also really important learning lessons.
So I have an idea that I've been trying to push for a while, and I just haven't had a chance to talk to all the right people. But I know, you know, I've had conversations with Sweeney and Ron, and we've had conversations with Sloan. But one thing, you know, if Howry were willing to support this, that would be great, would be to have a group of faculty and students go through the Indigenous mentoring program with Sweeney and Jeremy, and to do it again as faculty and students, and make it as place-based as we could for us, so that we could then use it in both the faculty space and the faculty student space. I think, you know, it's hard to think of what the right place is to fund that. I don't know if a national funder would go for it, but maybe it's something we need to do through the institution. But I've talked with Carlette about this when I first came in, but the timing hasn't been good. But maybe it will be better this year if we can figure out some way to do it. And I'm happy to throw whatever graduate college resources I can behind it. So if we can talk about that later sometime, maybe. So.
There's some great comments, some great ideas.
Can you read them?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. So from Sharon, this is great. It sounds like there may be a need for training for students navigating the university and graduate school, as well as training for faculty mentors and how to be good mentors for Indigenous students. Great point. And then Tony added in, also, we might look at look at materials / resources posted on the Native American Initiatives research portal. I can't remember what it stands for. This is a beautiful portal for all interested in what U of A does in terms of Native programs. It took a long time to create, and we can nourish it by posting materials there, but also seeing others posts. And then Tony, again, you're just on a roll, Tony. Last, Provost's office has a Steps in the Scholar Journey program designed to help postdoc fellows find a path to professorate, even your vocabulary, Tony, professorate in culturally meaningful ways. They're looking for folks to mentor. Program runs May 31st through June 3rd and is compensated for mentors.
May I say something on that? I was one of the mentors last summer. And the presentations in that process for the students were truly outstanding. I mean, they just laid out how the university systems work and where the pitfalls were, what some advantages were. I thought that was fabulous.
I participated as well. I also thought it was fantastic.
He comes at it, what is it?
All right. See, did that one, right?
I think that's it.
Yeah. Right, well, thank you so much for sharing.
Save the chat.
Yeah, we'll share the chat, hard to say. Tongue twister. Thanks so much for joining and sharing. We definitely want to continue and figure out what next steps we'd like to take. And yeah, this is our last training. We just took a bunch of key pillars that we thought were important. And Indigenous student mentoring is a whole big, long training in itself, as for each of those different topics. So thank you so much, and I wish you a beautiful day, and join our listserv, visit our website, resilience.arizona.edu, and continue to stay in touch with us. Thank you.
And I'll add one last little tidbit, it's okay. So later on, I'll send out a survey, and if you have any ideas or thoughts, like what would be a good topic to take up, or how would you like to see this training continue? And also thanks to Sharon and Air for supporting this and co-hosting it with us, because it really, I mean, I found one of the most helpful things just meeting every other week, meeting regularly with people interested in these areas. It's great, so thank you. And please sign in for food, so we have to do that in.
Yeah.
Take some food.
Oh,
and
I
sign.
still had it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm happy if anybody's interested in being in the Sloan faculty mentoring learning community. I'm happy to forward those things onto Maggie and Laura.
What is that?
So when the Sloan did their site visit, the faculty or
Oh,
Sloan mentors
yeah,
asked for
okay.
more information. So the idea was to make a mentoring community and maybe do a week like that as well.